Okay, we now have about 80 participants online, and we're going to start the webinar. Hello, good afternoon, good evening, whatever your time zone may be. My name is Aileen Ionescu-Summers. I'm Executive Director of Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. Global Entrepreneurship Monitor, many of you will know that it is a consortium of national country teams that work with prestigious academic institutions on entrepreneurship research. We carry out research on entrepreneurship around the world based on collecting data directly from entrepreneurs, individual entrepreneurs. And that is our distinguishing feature, because we really are the only research organization that collects data directly from individual entrepreneurs. And we do that through two different sources: GEM's Adult Population Survey, which provides analysis on the characteristics and motivations and ambitions of individuals starting businesses, as well as social attitudes towards entrepreneurship. And we also have another instrument, the National Expert Survey, that looks at the national context in which individuals start businesses. So it's a great pleasure for me today to welcome some of our panelists, the main author also of the most recent GEM Women's Entrepreneurship Report. And I'd like to just ask Amanda maybe to put up to share her slides with us, so that we can have a look at the report, the cover of the report. And then also I will subsequently introduce our sponsors and our panelists. So it'll give me great pleasure to sort of show you how we work with organizations, also strategically, in order to outreach our research on women's entrepreneurship. So there it is, the GEM 2021-22 Women's Entrepreneurship Report, which you will see in a moment as Amanda goes through the slides. We've termed it From Crisis to Opportunity, because there's quite a lot of really rich information indicating that women are really resilient, robust, and manage to forge their way through crisis in sometimes very surprising ways. Let's move on to just the next slide so that I can give you an idea of our sponsors, that enable us to actually carry out the research and write this report. Of course, Babson College is a founding organization of GEM and a world leader in academic research and teaching in entrepreneurship. And then we also work with the Cartier Women's Initiative, and in just a moment we will meet the managing director of that initiative, and she will explain what Cartier does as regards women's entrepreneurship. We also work with WeFi, which is the Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative, and we also have the leader of that organization here today. And missing here today, but also very, very invested in this report, is the School of Management at the University of Freiburg in Switzerland, that also supports this report because they have a particular interest in these topics. Now, if we turn to the next slide, you'll actually see what has now become some familiar faces, because you see the faces are in screen also. So we have Dr. Amanda Elam here. She is the lead author of this year's report and was also the lead author of last year's report. So she also works as a research fellow at the Diana International Research Institute at Babson College. Amanda, in just 2 sentences, can you just talk about Babson's and maybe the Research Institute's interest in women's entrepreneurship?
Okay, so very quickly, Babson College was one of the founding institutions behind the Global Entrepreneurship Monitor. It was a project back then, and it's now become really a global institution. So Babson was one of the founders, and also the first women's report was written by Babson scholars, specifically at the Center for Women's Entrepreneurial Leadership, which is the home of the Diana International Research Institute. And it's really key because, you know, at Sewell and at Deary, our goal is to really lead thought leadership around women's entrepreneurship and translate, not only generate research, but translate our research and the research of others into guidance for policymakers, for practitioners, for educators out there.
Thank you very much for that quick introduction. Winji Sampao is with us today. She is the Global Program Director from the Cartier Women's Initiative. And so Winji, can you give us an idea of why, you know, what is your organization, the main purpose, and then why a partnership with GEM?
Great. Thank you so much, Aileen. And it's a pleasure to be here today, especially with our collaborators in supporting the Women's Report. My name is Winji Sampaio, and I'm the Program Director for the Cartier Women Initiative. We are supporting women impact entrepreneurship because we would like the world, women impact entrepreneurs, to be able to realize their full potential. And 3 years ago, when we started in conversations with GEM, we learned about their work via Babson College, and I was so excited about this idea of bringing to light more data around women impact entrepreneurship and women entrepreneurs in general. And so we actually, in our program, leverage many of the GEM insight for our program design and to inform how we can move forward the overall ecosystem together.
Thank you. Thanks, Winji. Wendy Telecki is head of the Secretariat of the Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative. And perhaps you could also let us know, Wendy, what the main purpose of your organization is and why are you partnering with GEM?
Great. Thank you so much, Eileen, and to GEM for having me here today, and great to be on this panel with Amanda and Winji. WeFi is a partnership that sits in the World Bank and works with 14 donor countries around the world and almost all of the multilateral development banks that work around the developing world. And our focus is on supporting women entrepreneurs who are growing and creating jobs. And so we're trying to work with institutions around the world to change the way they interact with women entrepreneurs, to provide financing, skills, training, and improve the enabling environment for women entrepreneurs. So sitting at the World Bank, making sure that these programs, which we now have in about 60 countries around the world, designing their programs based on evidence is really, really important, and understanding what the data is showing us is really important. We started this partnership with GEM during the COVID pandemic, not surprisingly, because everybody was really starved for data, and having more sources of data to really understand what's going on with women entrepreneurs throughout their life cycle is really critical to us. So for us, you know, this ability to help build the evidence base, to continue to expand it, and really get down to the essential truths of what's happening with women entrepreneurs on the ground is really important, and why this partnership is very important for us.
Thank you very much, Wendy, for that. So actually now we're just going to get to the gems, if I can use that expression, the gems of this report, the golden nuggets. And I'm handing over to you, Amanda, to bring us through the main results of the report. Thank you.
Great. So I'm going to spend the next 10 minutes just walking through a few highlights. It's an enormous report this year. Many thanks to GEM Global for tolerating my extensive writing on that point. But I think the COVID data was particularly exciting to include this year. And so I think that that's one of the most, where I'll start, right? So the startup rates, gender gaps by country, level of national income. This is a chart from the report. We had 47 countries participate in the adult population survey this year. And I think if you really quickly, to look at the data on this chart, to benchmark it, you know, the global average for women this year was about 10% compared to about 13.5% of TEA, total early stage entrepreneurship activity around the world. And you'll notice just looking at this, the blues are the women, the orange are the men, markers indicate the men's rates by country. And you'll notice that typically the women's rates go up and down with men, but there are exceptions. In some countries, we have very wide gender gaps, whereas in other countries, we don't. So this kind of variation in rates across countries really supports the need for local assessments, right? I can give you global averages, the countries change every year, but one of the valuable aspects of GEM is that you can follow certain countries that participate every year. You generate this longitudinal data that can be very valuable. I'll also note that you'll see participation rates in high-income countries are very high, which means that all of the numbers, the averages are skewed towards what we see in high-income countries. And, looking at, at Wenji and Wendy here on the panel, they'll tell you we desperately need more data from countries in the low income, lower middle income, and upper middle income categories in these more developing or transitional contexts. So I just want to qualify, a lot of the averages that we talk about tend to be skewed towards what we observe in high income countries. Moving on to talking about the pandemic, in general, we saw that rates dipped very heavily in 2020 for a number of our indicators. And I think a lot of people have focused on the metric of business exit or business closure as an indicator for pandemics. And so I think you'll see here that women in low and lower middle income countries and high income countries experienced the reasons for exit at similar rates of men, right? So the number one reason for closing a business normally is that the business model didn't work, it wasn't profitable. But with a pandemic, you can see the impact that the pandemic had on the exit rates. Globally, the exit rate in 2021 for women was about 3.6%. And for men was 4.4% in that 47 countries. For the countries that participated in the last 3 years, our N was lower, and we really saw a drop in total entrepreneurship activity of 15% from year 1 to year 3. Also in intentions, also in established businesses. And we saw exits increase from 14% for women and higher for men, 20% for men. So one of the cautions I'm going to offer for studying business exits or business closures is, 1, pay attention to the reasons for business closure, but 2, keep in mind that those who are starting businesses at higher rates often have higher exit rates. So men tend to start businesses at higher rates, so their exit rate is often higher. So we offered a new stat in the report this year where we really looked at exit and entry ratios. And that's a really important ratio to understand, because when we look at that, we find that actually women were impacted more by exits due to pandemic impacts globally than what we would find in other just using exits alone. And you'll notice from this chart too, it kind of paints the story that women in upper middle income countries actually felt a stronger impact of the pandemic than women compared to men in lower and lower middle income and high income countries. So again, local assessments are really important to understand how the pandemic's impacting. The other advantage of some of the measurement we did with COVID impacts in the GEM program is we actually looked at digital tools, which I think a lot of people around the world were really hopeful that the adoption of digital tools could really help a lot of businesses offset the impact of the pandemic, particularly for women who tend to be overrepresented among the smallest, most vulnerable businesses, where they often delay or can't afford to get digital tools in place. And here you actually see some interesting data in this chart. We looked at the adoption of new digital tools for both our TEA number, so our nascent and early stage entrepreneurs, but also for our established business owners. And you'll see that the TEA group, the new businesses, less than 3.5 years old, were much more likely to adopt digital tools. They were also more positive about the opportunities that they could see as a result of the COVID pandemic compared to established business owners. When we look at gender differences, you'll notice that it varies a lot by level of national income. In other words, the digital tools adoption rates were much higher for women in low and lower middle income countries than what we see in high income countries, and also higher than men, trended higher than men in the upper middle income countries. But when it comes to established business owners, again, we see some different patterns. We also asked whether they plan to use more digital tools after going forward as a result of the pandemic. And you see some measurement here as well. Again, the new businesses tend to outperform, and for women, it seems to matter the most, in the low and lower middle income countries compared to men. So there's a lot more work we have to do on digital tools. I've done some other research I'll be presenting at World Trade Organization Gender Conference next month that looks at the types and uses of tools. And it turns out that matters a lot for, for the impacts and also the challenges of adopting these tools. So some good news there. One of the other advantages of the GEM methodology is actually that while it's cross-sectional, we're actually measuring, intentions, startup, nascent activity, established new businesses, so businesses that are paying wages under 3.5 years old, established businesses, so older businesses, as well as business exit. And that gives us a life cycle view of what's happening in different countries. I think one of the most remarkable aspects of taking this perspective, the lifestyle perspective for understanding gendered behavior and entrepreneurship, is that women's intentions are really high. And in the Middle East and Africa, they're particularly high, right? And these are countries that are working very hard to support women entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurial intentions are tied very closely to culture. If the culture believes that there's an opportunity for you, that that this is a good place for you to spend your times, that it's appropriate, gender appropriate for you to do it, the women are responding. And so this should be a takeaway for a lot of countries, that if governments, policymakers, local NGOs or other supporting organizations, universities, schools will actually make the effort to better support women entrepreneurs, to get out there and talk about the importance, I think that women will respond. However, we still have a challenge, and that is that while women's intentions are very high, astronomically high in a lot of countries in this region, their ability to translate those intentions into actual startup activity is something we see globally is a challenge, right? Intentions tend to be twice as high as the very first steps in startup, but it's particularly challenging in these countries where they're really working hard to support women entrepreneurs. More is needed. Right? How do we actually help these women translate intentions into business startup? Okay, and so then this brings me to another insight that I think is really important. We've spent years and years talking about how women trail men. They're not starting businesses at as higher rates as men. Their intentions aren't as high. Their established business rates aren't as high. But we really understand that globally we're going through this transformative phase following, a lot of really important accomplishments in the 20th century. We've gained a lot, but we're still going through a global transformation and our aspirations for gender equality. And I think that we spend a lot of time comparing rates and not enough time talking about who is involved in the actual work, right? And so when we're looking at high potential startups, we often look at metrics like, are these businesses expecting to create a lot of jobs? Are these businesses actually offering products that are innovative to their local markets? Are these businesses actually participating in internationalization, high export rates? And so I think this is just for Europe, the European region. And I think it's really important to look that in some countries, women constitute more than 50% of the individuals actually participating in these high potential categories by these 3 metrics. And so policymakers and program leaders should be finding ways to support these women, because these women are making significant contributions to economic growth and social development in their countries. And it's about time we change that conversation. It's not women trailing men. It's that women are right out there starting and growing companies alongside of men that are making big impacts on their local and national economies. Industry composition by gender. I think that for those of you who've certainly followed my work will know that I push that balance of cultural and structural factors that contribute to the observed patterns we see between men and women. And it's really important because in most studies of gender and entrepreneurship, the 2 most important explanatory variables for the outcomes and for the gender differences is industry composition and it is business size. So for industry composition, this just kind of brings it up front and real as we look at the variations across levels of national income. Most people around the world, most entrepreneurs around the world are working in the wholesale and resale sectors. But there's a lot of variation in gender participation rates in other sectors. So again, globally, women tend to be much more likely to participate in startups serving government, health, education, social services. Right? Much less likely to be involved in startups in ag and mining and manufacturing, transport, and most disturbingly in ICT. So in, in the internet communications technology sector, this is where most of the venture capital is going to new businesses around the world. So when we talk about women being underfunded, a lot of it is because they're not operating in sectors that receive the most funding at the same rates as men. And so I think industry is an incredibly important factor. And then you can see again by national income level that that the variations are quite wide. And in fact, for ICT, the orange, we see that the gender gap really starts emerging in upper middle income classes and then into high income classes. So why is it that women are starting businesses in different sectors as these countries become more advanced? And we see a lot more equity. In fact, women in some countries in the lower and lower middle income categories are actually participating in ICT at higher rates than men. I think it's really important that we explore some of these variations. Similar with business size. I think we talk a lot about how women are much more likely to be self-employed, have no employees compared to men, but that isn't true for all countries. And it isn't true particularly, in the less developed context. So understanding that women in these low and lower middle income and upper middle income countries are actually creating jobs at incredibly high rates, right up there with men, I think is really important. And we do, of course, see some of the largest companies created in the high income. So again, the numbers in our data set have a tendency to be skewed towards the high income countries that have a high participation rate. But these are incredibly important factors for understanding business outcomes. Businesses with a lot of employees tend to have higher revenue. I don't think that's rocket science, but I think it's really important for us to understand what is happening, the types of businesses. When it comes to demographics, this is sort of a question people have been fixated on for as long as I've been involved in looking at women in business patterns, and that is that there's in entrepreneurship more generally, right? Do we see different types of patterns from people at different ages, at different education levels, at different levels of income class? And in the GEM data, we find the biggest differences observable in household income compared to age and compared to education. That can vary depending on the country, but in general, I think it's really, I thought this data was really interesting this year, where we actually find that in lower and low income and lower middle income countries, that the poorest, that the entrepreneurs aren't necessarily coming from the poorest households. And there's a little chicken and egg there, right? Is it wealthy people who are more likely to start businesses, or is it, or is it poor people who start businesses, become more affluent? So I think there's more work to do here, but I think that this is a really important, statistic to consider, metric to consider from the GEM data this year. And I guess the gender part of this is, you'll notice that men tend to be wealthier across all levels. and so that it is in high income and upper middle income countries that poor women are more likely to start businesses than poor men. So what's happening there? And then this is my final slide. And I think, again, one of the most important opportunities we had this year in the report is that GEM also runs, along with the Adult Population Survey, runs a national expert survey every year. So we had 50 countries participate this year in the national, or last year rather, in the national expert survey. And they included a gender module. So we had 6 questions the national experts were asked specifically about the enabling environment for women entrepreneurs. So do women receive equal cultural support compared to men? And across all of the national experts surveyed, the answer was generally negative, right? No, women are not receiving, which really begs the question, if we're looking at women entrepreneurs having a lower than average confidence in their startup skills, or if they are less likely to say they see opportunities for business startup, or if they have more fear of failure, isn't that a rational fear? If you've got national experts saying that the cultural environment for women is not supportive, it kind of changes the conversation. It doesn't mean that women don't need us to go in, and women entrepreneurs don't need us to go in and kind of boost their confidence in whatever ways we can, but it does suggest that they are rational actors making, educated decisions about the odds of support and resources. So there were some other questions included in here as well around favorable regulations, equal access to finance, to procurement, sufficient family support services for women entrepreneurs, and telework. And as you can see here on the chart, at the global level across those 50 countries, it was really equal access to finance and procurement and telework where we saw some positive assessments. But in general, cultural support is lacking. The regulations are not supportive of the women entrepreneurs or the types of businesses they start. And there aren't really sufficient family support services available. And I think we saw that in a very painful way during the pandemic, right? Where when the market shut down and schools and care facilities shut down, women, even more than men also, parents and sons were also taking on some family care responsibilities, but women were disproportionately impacted. And this is something that I think the government should pay a little bit more attention to in policy interventions going forward. So the final takeaway from the report are the recommendations for policy and practice, and we offered 4 this year. The first is to support high potential women entrepreneurs. This is particularly important in male-dominated sectors. So the women who are out there participating, in ICT, in manufacturing and transport, in ag and mining are much more likely to get hit with those negative stereotypes against women, because it's in those male-dominated sectors that gender becomes more salient and those negative stereotypes are triggered. But our data suggests that when you compare apples to apples, our other published data suggests that women starting the same businesses as men are just as likely to be successful. And so we really need to find ways to address those stereotypes. I think it's, again, really important to recognize that that business types, markets, industry sectors, those types of factors are the most important predictors for business survival and success. It's not necessarily about gender. It's also really important, I think, that we mobilize financing and support to women operating in current sectors, right? So in the government and social services, in consumer services, in some of these other sectors where investors don't participate at high rates. Maybe they need to take a closer look at the opportunities for return on investment in these sectors. I think that the whole trend towards impact investing is literally about reallocating capital to the sectors where businesses are started and created that really advance social development as well as economic health. And so I think that's important. And then finally, we really need to celebrate the successful women founders, the women who are already out there starting and growing these excellent businesses. They're really critical role models. As I do keynote lectures or other speaking directly to students, the young women coming up, they don't necessarily see those successful role models, and they really need to know that if other women before them have done this, there's nothing that can hold them back from achieving as well or even better than their peers. There you go. That is our our high-level overview.
High-level overview. Thank you very much, Amanda. It's actually quite challenging to do because I think the research actually produces so many results in so many ways and so many dimensions that it's quite a job to actually filter through and prioritize. So those are some of the really key, I suppose, gems from the results, as I called it. Let's try and digest it a little bit. I'm wondering, Winji, would you mind? Can you let us have your immediate reaction to what you're hearing, and maybe you can also point to perhaps some of the things that you're hearing that inform your own strategy that actually are useful for you to know because of the things that you're doing in your organization.
Sure. So in our program that supports women impact entrepreneurs, I'm relieved to hear that Amanda's key recommendation, we have implemented many of them. So very happy to know that we are hopefully on the right track and continue to grow the program in a way that is, as Wendy described, evidence-based program design. I think, the four things that Amanda highlighted around high potential woman impact woman entrepreneurs are definitely the segment of women entrepreneurs that we have been focusing on. So women entrepreneurs that are trying to grow, rather it's internationally, rather it's in terms of the organizational size and also in terms of their innovative offering. And then in terms of recognizing the importance of sectors, for us, that has also been a really key finding that has informed our program design since 2 years ago, when I think 2 editions ago, when the Women's Report was describing, the importance of the focus on sectors. And, at that time, we also thought a lot about sort of as the next phase of our growth for our program, how should we grow our program? And it was at that time we decided to launch, in collaboration with Hello Tomorrow, the Science and Technology Pioneer Program category. And we hope in the next edition to have the intention to grow further and support more entrepreneurs in that program category specifically. And that specifically, I think, talks a lot about, women in these sectors that are creating a lot of innovative solutions, solving a lot of the social and environmental challenges, but still facing a lot of difficulties. And we hope that via growing our program in that direction, that we can help support them further.
Thanks for that, Wendy. Could I maybe turn to you, Wendy, and get another perspective from, in fact, Women Entrepreneurs Finance Initiative? What are you thinking as you hear these results? Are there any kind of aha moments for you? Oh, yeah, you're on mute.
Thanks.
Yeah.
The research is great, and it's so wonderful to see this data set as it goes from year to year, because it really tells us a lot about what's changing. And also the differences between, for example, the high income and middle income countries, which is very important for us. We work about 60% of our funds are in low income countries. So about 40% goes to lower middle income countries. And looking at the differences between how these markets play out and in a time of volatility is really very, very helpful, because it helps us calibrate as donor organizations that come from the high income countries, thinking about what we can do to most effectively support the lower middle income and low income countries. We really need to understand those differences. And so, these issues around the resilience of entrepreneurs and how, things did get very tough, but they are bouncing back is really important. But to see the difference, we hear a lot in the US, at least, about the Great Resignation and huge levels of entrepreneurship scaling up. And we don't see that in the same way happening in developing countries. So seeing that play out in the numbers, I think, is really helpful for us. and to understand the fundamental constraints that these entrepreneurs are facing, with higher exit rates, with kind of lower rebound rates is really important. So we see this, we had an entrepreneur come here and speak from Nigeria. She's a baker and she's grown her company from 5 employees to 300, but she was affected by wheat prices because of the conflict in Ukraine. She was affected by COVID, and the overlapping complications of the lives of these women who really want to grow, who want to create jobs, who want to create economic growth in their community. They're very real, and it comes through in the numbers here about how challenging it is for these women. The other thing I think is really key here is this focus on technology and innovation, and where we do see women actually using technology and innovating at the same rates as men. And we need to find ways to help them really leverage that for growth. And so finding more ways to work with accelerators and incubators. We do a lot of that, for example, with the Inter-American Development Bank in Central America, working with STEM entrepreneurs, getting more women into that space, getting them comfortable with new technologies, e-commerce, things like that. That's really, really critical. And I think this research shows that that's actually a huge opportunity, that women are doing the innovation, they're willing to innovate more, and they can really see that as a path to growth. So we need to see more women getting into those non-traditional sectors.
Okay, thank you, Wendy. I was just wondering, Amanda, considering that you also wrote the report last year, which will still be very fresh in your memory. So if you look at last year's report and this year's report, what kind of almost is a counterintuitive result, if any, or surprising, anything that stands out from one year to the other that really was maybe unexpected, or have you any view on that? Or
well, I think I think there are 2 that jump out at me, right? One is that we had the opportunity this year to look at the enabling environment, and the cultural support finding was really important to me because as a woman entrepreneur myself too, right? I'm really sensitive to this idea that women have lower confidence, because I don't see it as lower confidence. I see it as a rational calculation of where I'm going to find support or not find support. And it's something I navigate. And so I think that was a really important finding this year. And I think the second probably really important insights that from year to year that our report offers really has to do with COVID. And, we're giving a highlight and just select graphs from the reports and the summary. But we have a whole chapter on the COVID impacts. And, and I think what we saw there is that women were impacted similarly to men in the lower income and higher income countries, but we saw a lot of volatility in the upper middle income countries that we need to understand better. But I think that in general, women were slightly more impacted, right? Established business owner rates for women went down by 14% for over this 2-year period, but only went down for 9% for men. So everybody was hit. Women were just hit a little bit harder. It can vary by level of national income. So I hope that everyone will take a chance to dig into the report and really see where their countries or their regions came out.
Yeah. I'm just going to add a little question from the audience here. By the way, if you've got some questions, please pop them on the Q&A. We may not get to all the questions because we have very little time today. It's just 1 hour of a webinar, but we certainly will try and answer those questions maybe outside of the webinar, if not today. But I'm going to read out 2 for you, Amanda. It seems lack of financing is either second or third reason for business closure. Can you comment on that and how it might relate with a weak business model? And I'm following that up with another related to access to finance. Here's the second one, which is access to finance seems not to be an issue in the enabling environment. Can you comment on this, since the statistics we have from the few central banks that report on gender disaggregated data show different pictures. Women have lower access, lower credit lines, and pay higher interest rates, etc. So,
right. Well, I think there's, I think the important thing on the first question is to remember that we're actually surveying the entrepreneurs themselves, right?
Yeah.
Right. Or actually, and I think that, or the business owners themselves, because exit is really a population level. So it's anybody who's exited a business, whether it was new or established. And the reasons for exit were the people who said yes, right? So why did you close it? So first of all, consider the sample. And then secondly, what I would say is that GEM measures informal and formal business activity. So we're talking about a very broad population of businesses, and not all businesses are looking for debt capital or equity capital, aren't looking for financing. Some businesses, aren't eligible for that. So I would say when you're looking at the GEM data, keep in mind that it's a really broad, it's everybody from a local vegetable vendor to someone who's starting and growing the next tech platform. And so I think we have to be really careful around, drawing too many conclusions. If we went in and did a subgroup analysis around the ICT sector, we might see a different priority in terms of the reasons for business closure. Yeah. And what was the second question, Aileen?
It's a long one, but I read again.
Expert survey. Yeah, it was the expert survey. So for the expert survey, remember the sample again is we're talking to national experts.
Yeah.
And so, this is their perception. This is their opinion. And what I don't know about those national experts is I don't know how many of them are focused on the tech sector or looking very broadly across all sectors, or who may be focused, for example, on consumer products or business products. And so I think, again, it really depends. We're getting surveying sort of broad perceptions on that kind of thing. I think the other thing that happens with experts is that, I think I can speak for all of us, but we're usually looking at this, we're assessing the system, right? And we're saying, so are we seeing people get access to financing? Is the capital there? Are people getting access to it? And that might be true very broadly, but that might not be true for subsegments of the, new business and established business populations. They may not have equal access.
Okay. Wendy, actually, given your focus as an organization, you may like to pitch in here on the access to finance aspects. There? Yeah.
Is that for me, Eileen?
Yes, Wendy.
Okay. Great, thank you. This is a great question, and we focus a lot on access to finance at WeFi. About half of our funding goes to closing finance gaps. And I think what the questions point to is a total lack of data on the supply side. So from the financial institutions and from regulators in terms of what's actually happening with financing from the financial sector perspective. And we know, like, for example, OECD collects this information on a sex disaggregated basis, and only 5 or 6 countries actually are providing that information. So the lack of data on the supply side is really critical, and it makes the demand side data, like this data, much more important to our understanding of the challenges. But there's a lot of reinforcing issues with the data here, because women do have more or kind of less appetite for risk. Often we see that. And I think Amanda's point about, well, why is that? Or is that a rational response to what they're hearing, what they're seeing from the financial sector, from regulators and others? And I think there is partially that. We also know that investors, if you're looking at VC, only a very small percent, under 5% of venture capital goes to women-founded funds. Very few investors are women. So these things really have a big impact on women's appetite to really try to get funding and their willingness to put themselves out there for financing. Getting better role models, having more women in the investment space, making investment decisions is really critically important here. And I think as we see more women moving into that space, we'll see an uptick in not only the acceptance rates of women, but also their interest in taking on financing to grow their businesses and not just kind of do a slow growth or a flat growth projection. So these things are really important in the policy side. The policy response to moving these things forward is really critical. I mean, we saw in the report, I think, something very interesting, which is not necessarily expected, but I've seen it in other data also, which is that more women than men said that the policy response from COVID did have an effect on them. So some positivity in terms of when governments decide to act, that actually it can have an impact on women. And when your constraints are so high, in terms of getting access to markets, getting access to finance, really, those policy interventions can make a difference. And so we need to continue to work with policymakers to change laws, to change regulations, to change incentives for the private sector and the public sector institutions that are working with women entrepreneurs.
Great answer. Thank you so much, Wendy. I'm actually going to look at another question here, Amanda. In the reasons for exit, high-income countries showed other as a significant reason for exits and closures. Do you recall, or have you access to what was provided within the other category?
Right. So there's a whole bucket, but it includes everything from, personal reasons to government regulations. And I think that the fact that the other category is higher for high income countries is important, because these tend to be highly regulated, high regulation industries are well represented there.
And another kind of, I suppose, housework type question, which is, did the survey capture employee numbers and characteristics, increase, decrease of employees, types of employees, part-time, full-time, temporary, etc.? Did women entrepreneurs tend to hire more women? I'll let you answer that, but we don't really go into that degree of detail.
We do have counts. We do know how many employees they have, but since we're not following companies over time, we can't tell you how that changes for trends for individual countries. Again, we're cross-sectional. We can do snapshots and show what's happening in these populations and subpopulations, at a high level. There are other data sets out there that have really captured. I think probably the enterprise survey data at the World Bank, Wendy, has the best on operational details, the best data. Yeah. And actually has data that answers the question about the gender of the employees in firms led by men and women. There's tend to be, again, formal registered companies, and they tend to be more established.
Okay, thank you. Here, the slide on entrepreneurial life cycle statistics from North Africa only. We don't see West, East, and Central Africa here. Is it because the data is insufficient, or difficult to obtain, or too diverse?
Yeah, absolutely. We do have it for the 47 countries that participated. So know that. I just gave you one region, but within that region, absolutely. And you'll see, for example, in our Central and East Asia region, we only had 4 countries participate in 2021. This is where what Wendy has talked about, the lack of data, not only around financing, but also just generally around what's happening in the informal and formal sectors around business startup and growth. We just don't have a lot of data for these countries. And the way, Aileen, you may want to talk a little bit about how GEM works, but basically we have a country team in every country, usually at a university. And so if there are teams in some of these countries who are really interested in generating this kind of data, we'd love to talk to them about participation in the GEM program.
Yes, thanks for that. And I will be mentioning that a little bit at the end as well, but it's great to bring it up here. Wenji, can I turn to you? Because one of the, our focus at GEM is really to make sure that policymakers are listening, and hearing and basing their decisions on hard data and outcomes also from our research. And furthermore, the sponsors that are supporting our national teams, and we have about 60 national teams, they are mainly governments and policy-making departments. So Winji, I mean, what do you think a policymaker might be extricating from the research? And if they were, wanting to move into a much more promotional mode, for the woman and entrepreneur, what are you getting out of the report that might be useful input for them?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think rather it's from the entrepreneurs that we meet within our program, or entrepreneurs who apply to our program. And also, I think when looking at this GEM research, I think access to financing for women entrepreneurs has been challenging, both in terms of working capital as well as growth capital. And so for us, I think for the policymakers, it's a policy that's supportive of growth in gender lens investing, the infrastructure for overall more financing towards impact-driven business, and support for women on how to access those financing. I think there's the know-how also is very important. So for us, I think financing remains to be a very critical missing piece for all the entrepreneurs that we meet. And
Okay, thank you. Wendy, can I maybe ask you the same question?
Yeah, sure. I think, I think one thing, if you start with the softer side of what comes out of this, which is our understanding of who a woman entrepreneur is, and the fact that, we have to move away from this idea that it's just subsistence enterprises or it's a social safety net program. We still see a lot of that bias when we go into countries and talk to them about women's entrepreneurship. Oh, we have a social safety net program, or we have a payment system so that they can transfer social payments to women entrepreneurs. Really shifting the dialogue with the government to say, these are growth opportunities. These are the women, the entrepreneurs that are going to solve these challenging issues in your society, whether it be climate or healthcare issues or the care economy challenges that so many countries are facing. Once you shift that framework, you can begin to understand as a government how the policies really need to change to enable growth for these women entrepreneurs, and not just, getting by in this with subsistence and income, basic income generation. So you can look at ways that you can really change the financial regulatory environment to improve sex disaggregated data, but also to do things like improve innovation in the financial sector so that women who don't have the same level of asset accumulation can get loans without collateral, for example. And think about that really in terms of how do women create businesses and grow, even if they don't have, strong collateral for their businesses. There's a lot of new alternatives that are out there now that can benefit those women. What about procurement? You're signaling, if you're the government and you have procurement policies that include women entrepreneurs, you're signaling that if you're doing construction, if you're doing something in the ICT sector, if you're doing something in the healthcare sector, you believe there are women out there that will be able to grow businesses in those sectors. That's really an important signal to say that we don't just see women in agriculture, we don't just see women in retail, we see them in the industries that are going to lead our country forward. And then just on policies, like the kinds of things that you see happening under Women, Business, and the Law, the review that the World Bank does, to look at really fundamental laws that need to change. I think that's critical. One of the really interesting parts of the report is the regional breakdowns. And I read the part about MENA with great interest, because there's so much aspiration in that region amongst women. And there are really impressive attempts to try to improve the enabling environment, but they have so much further to go. So there's really a huge opportunity in a place like that to fundamentally, look at the legal system and the regulatory system. So there's so many things that you can do, but I think it all starts with that mindset shift to say we're not just looking at, subsistence or side hustles. We're looking at the women who are going to drive the economy going forward.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That was a really rich response. I actually noticed that now that we're moving to the end of the webinar, we're getting the most incredibly rich questions here from our participants. I'll take one of them, but unfortunately I can't take more because we have to wrap up afterwards. So here it is, Amanda. Did the crisis, the COVID crisis, increase the gender gap for entrepreneurial intention, entrepreneurial activity? If so, did the gap increase more or less in low, middle income countries? Is any special policy needed in this new scenario?
So the answer is in some countries, but not in others. Right. So I'll encourage you to read the report to see what happened in those specific. I mean, at an international level, the answer is that intentions, it went down for men and women at the same rate, but that we saw the gap increase for actual startup activity. We saw the most tremendous gap for established businesses. And, you know, and exits are a little complicated because they're tied to entry rates. But we do address that in the report as well. So, but again, I think it's really important to understand that women run some of the most vulnerable businesses in the world, but also run some of the highest potential businesses in the world. And this is part of what I think Wendy was just speaking to, is that we really need to think about these things in very different ways than we have in the past. Okay, thank you, Amanda. I'm afraid I cannot cover the other questions, but we'll attempt to give you an answer offline. I'd like to thank Winji and Wendy and Amanda for their inputs today. Very, very informative, and also to get the perspectives of not only GEM itself, but from two other organizations. Amanda, would you mind just putting up our last slide there? Yep. Please. Thank you. Coming up. Okay, I think it's just the next one. Yeah. So this is just an idea of how you can connect with us on social media, where you can visit. You can download, obviously, the report if you've not done so already. And as Amanda pointed out earlier, we really need to cover more ground in terms of GEM national teams. So if you sitting out there are in a research institution and you sense that you may be interested in forming a GEM national team, then please do contact us on the email address that's just there, info@gemconsortium.org. And then, as you have met some of our extremely valued sponsors today, you might like to know that next year we're also going to be, and every year we're also going to be producing another Women's Entrepreneurship report, and we hope to build further the consortium, if you like, of sponsors around this report. It's extremely valuable exercise to benchmark with our sponsor organizations. We also very, very shortly will be launching our European regional report. We will be doing so before Christmas, so watch out for that. It's nearly in production. And next year, also regarding sponsorship, we're keenly interested in finding some partners to work with us on a report which is focused on impact of entrepreneurship on the Sustainable Development Goals, as we have been collecting some related to data in the survey as regards this. But really, thank you very much for joining us today. We had about 120 people listening to us, which is fantastic. We also had a further 180 or so that will be receiving the recording, and very much interested to hear your feedback. So please do contact us if you want to provide any feedback. And again, we will try and answer those remaining questions offline. Thanks again to our sponsors. Thank you, Winji. Thanks, Wendy. And thank you so much, Amanda. I got so many very nice comments about your presentation.
and the value of it. So I think you probably have seen that in the Q&A. So bye-bye, and
thank you, Eileen.
thank you
Yeah,
very much.
Thank you so
Thank you,
much.
everyone.
Yep. Bye,
Cheers.
everyone.
Bye-bye. Thank you.